Gene's talk this morning, I found it really interesting because from my perspective, a lot of the things he's talking about in the iteration, bringing DevOps together perhaps with a lot of the security stuff that we do, is kind of a lot of the internal practice we use actually in software development at Sophos. We're a DevOps shop, and we do a lot of the stuff that Gene was talking about. But we're also looking at how we can do that not just iteratively in our products, but iteratively with our customers to learn from what they're experiencing in the field from being exposed to all the threats that we see out there, and how we can very quickly and agile again, learn from those things and integrate those into our processes so that not only are we building hopefully better products, but perhaps being able to provide better advice and share that information across the customer base who has a lot less security experience than a lot of us have. And so today, though, I'm here to talk about the black hole exploit kit. We've been doing a lot of research on this for the last couple of years since it came to be. And of all the threats that we see out there, this is one of the #1 things that is infecting people through drive-by infections and these types of things, which is a big part of this. I mean, when you really look at the big picture of certainly the malware fight out there, you've got this very, very tiny percentage that's targeted threats, even though that targeted threat vector has expanded to not just be defense contractors anymore. I mean, everybody's having to deal with those things to a degree, but we can't find them because of the deluge of the garden variety malware that's often being spewed out through things like black hole. And that's part of the challenge, is that we can't focus on the problem that we're really scared about because we're too busy fighting fires all the time of the rest of this junk that's attacking everybody's networks. And when we start looking at, for example, in the lab at Sophos, we see somewhere around, on an average day, about 25,000 new malicious URLs. And of those 25,000 malicious URLs, somewhere around 50%, give or take, by week, are using the black hole exploit kit as the primary exploit suite being served up to the endpoints to infect them. So when you're talking about nearly half of the opportunistic malware problem, it's a giant source of the stuff that's causing people to become infected when they're not patching and all these other things. Obviously, it's not even to do with patching anymore. When we saw the number of Java 0 days that have occurred in the last 6 months being used by kits like this as well, it becomes a really big challenge, because it's not just have you done what you should do, which most of us are always behind in getting there, but then what can you do beyond that, and what are the tactics these guys are using. So that's basically the premise here, is to go a little bit through the history of how it works and how it's being distributed and what the primary methods these guys are using in order to infect sites and get the stuff out there. And then the other side of it, which is what do we see on the endpoints at our organizations as a result of this junk, and how can we build better defenses to hopefully at least maybe knock out half of this opportunistic malware stuff that's hitting the average endpoint in an organization. So I was prepped for source by some of my colleagues saying that this is a more technical crowd than a lot of the crowds that we speak to. So some of the information in here, I probably spent a little less time on like this, and introducing the idea that there are these exploit kits out there. Now, if you look through the different numbers of exploit kits, there's somewhere around 150 or so that have been known to have been talked about in underground forums, that have been caught in some form or another. When you're talking about black hole being half of it, the other half is probably split between 30 or 40 of the common ones. I mean, a lot of people have heard of things like Eleanor and Crime Pack and a whole bunch of these other Phoenix. There's a whole ton of them out there. Most of them aren't very well distributed or popular. But there's a huge amount of people interested in getting in on this game because there's so much money to be made. I mean, exploit kits are being used primarily for distributing, well, what was fake AV up until about a year ago, which is those gangs have seemed to have transitioned into ransomware now. But almost all ransomware is distributed through things like black hole. We see lots of very selective payloads. Because black hole can direct traffic from such a large volume of websites, when you're talking about 10 or 15,000 new URLs every day, and those URLs may stay infected for an average of 6 to 10 weeks at a pop before they get cleaned up, there's a huge attack surface of the number of sites, which means a very diverse number of people being exposed to the kits. So we see the traffic directing servers, which is, you take a whole bunch of the websites you've infected and funnel them into these traffic directing servers, and then you can be very selective about the payloads you're going to deliver from a kit like this, depending on perhaps geographic, geo-IP, who the victim looks like. So you may have a banking Trojan that's targeting Deutsche Bank. And you go, well, everybody that's German that hits this, I want to serve up a Deutsche Bank Zeus Trojan that's been customized and, you know, do web injects and all this type of thing. Whereas when it's an average American and they're not likely to be a customer of Deutsche Bank, I'm going to serve up some FBI ransomware because that's the best way for me to monetize that particular traffic. And we see a lot of very advanced traffic directing stuff going on with specifically the Zeus kit because of the huge number of clients that are being exposed to the websites every day that it's hosted on. You know, standard mechanisms apply for infecting websites, right? People still using FTP to update their websites with clear text passwords. You know, workstations getting infected and passwords being stolen, SQL injection. I mean, you know, standard infection methods to get it onto a site. Now, in the fall of 2012, we saw version 2.0 announced, and we started kind of going back through what we had seen. We had been going through the release history a bit of different versions of the kit as we're tracking it from its inception in summer of 2010. And then it accelerated more and more as it gained in popularity. You see the quantity of releases in 2012. Now, there's two reasons primarily that we see Black Hole iterating. One reason, of course, is to avoid detection by the antivirus vendors, the web security vendors, even IDS and IPS often can see signatures for particular exploits the way they're designed to work in Black Hole. The other reason, of course, is to introduce new versions of exploits, you know, to stay on top of the best way to infect people. The text here in Russian basically says, we're pleased to welcome you to Black Hole 2.0 and a brand new version of a bundle of exploits. For more than 2 years of the existence of our project, the old engine arrival and ligaments are badly worn. AV companies have become quick to recognize this kind of criteria as being black hole and flag it as malware. In the new version, we have rewritten from scratch. It is not only the issuance of new exploits, but a brand new admin panel and antivirus evasion techniques of the innovations on this, and it goes on for a little bit about all the new features aside from just including new JAR and PDF payloads and more things to, well, Black Hole, I believe in 2.0, they added in a kind of their own virus total. So they've got their own back-end engine that shows you in real time how many of the given exploits are being detected by AV vendors that are in your version of the kit. And even that's becoming a little bit outmoded, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. It's mostly being used today as a software as a service offering more than it is as a product. But that stuff was all modified with you know, new exploits. And they also intentionally keep a lot of old exploits in the kit. So when we see some of the exploits being used, even in current versions of Black Hole, unfortunately, they know some of the tactics that we're up to in the industry, and that we used to like to scan the web with, you know, Windows XP, Service Pack 0, and Reader 8, and we wanted to be as vulnerable as possible so we can collect payloads when we're out there scanning URLs that may be infected. And unfortunately now, they're getting clever about not exposing their 0 days so that we don't know that they have them necessarily, because they'll use the oldest viable exploit against a given victim. So you know, these things are always you know, shifting, and it does become challenging for us, because how many times can you scan the same URL to say, now I'm Windows, now I'm Linux, now I'm Mac, now I'm XP Service Pack 3, now I'm Vista, now I'm 7, now I'm Reader 10. It really becomes a complex issue, because simply just scanning the URLs themselves is challenging enough when you're looking at the volumes that you need to scan in order to have an idea of where bad things are coming from. And when you compound that with trying to figure out all the different variations to see how the bad actors are changing their tactics, it becomes a monumental challenge. This is probably the first super successful new business model since Partnerka. If you're familiar with how the Canadian pharmacy junk worked and started back in the early 2000s with these partner networks based out of the Russian Business Network in St. Petersburg and things. They kind of forged a new model of malware distribution, which showed how it could truly be profitable, which has created this explosion of opportunistic malware we've seen over the last 10 years or so. And that was this affiliate network thing, right, where it's sort of like it's a malicious Amway multi-level marketing network, assuming, depending how you feel about Amway, it may be just like Amway is criminal, and if you think Amway is legitimate, then it's a criminal version of that. But that was, you know, the big business model that drove all this growth in the past 10 or 15 years. It's what spread the fake antivirus and the Canadian penis pills and all this other stuff. And this software as a service model for exploits is kind of now the next thing, right? There's more and more of these exploit kits coming out now that are using this model. Black Hole kind of innovated it. And if, again, we translate some of the Russian from the advertising here, we can see that they're saying you can rent the kit for a day for $50, and you're limited to 50,000 victim hits. You can rent it for a week for $200 and 70,000 hit limit. You can rent it for the month for $500, also a 70,000 hits per day limit. Oh, sorry, these are all per day, the hit limits. And if needed, you can raise the traffic limit for an additional fee. So again, we're seeing sort of basically the malicious version of Amazon EC2 being offered by these guys. But there's a real advantage. I mean, you can buy the kit. You can buy a one-year license for $1,500 for the kit and host it on your own servers and that kind of thing. But really buying it as a service makes a heck of a lot more sense, because if tomorrow morning there's a new Java 0-day, then you're going to get that instantly, right? As soon as the guy that runs the kit introduces the new exploit, anybody that's using it as a cloud service instantly is upgraded to the new version and has all the latest exploits and techniques and evasion against antivirus. Whereas if you buy the kit for a year, you're stuck in time. You don't get updates for that year. So you just paid the $1,500 outright, and maybe a month later, you're fully detected by everyone, and you're only going to get the weakest victims that have absolutely no security on their systems whatsoever. So there's incentive there to do it. The other incentive is that if you use it as a cloud service, they also will help you rotate domain names and IP addresses to avoid that way as well. So the cloud automatically is contiguously shifting to avoid IP-based blacklists, DNS-based blacklists, and that type of thing. So it's really a set it and forget it mode if you buy it as a service from these guys, as opposed to trying to manage it on your own system. And there's all kinds of little extra service fees that you can see in there where they talk about, if you want a bunch more domain names, or you want to shift IPs faster, or you need more diversity, or you need more traffic, you can pay $100 more a month or $50 more a month for each one of these different types of services that are available. Now, one of the challenges, so when it's cloud-based, it's super challenging for us because we can't see the source. I mean, typically, if a site gets infected with the Eleanor exploit kit and it happens to be on, say, Rackspace, that's fantastic for us, right? Because we know all the Rackspace guys. One of your customers is infected. Can you send us the PHP or whatever's on that system so we can take a look and see exactly what they're doing? Very few people are buying Black Hole, and since it's always on criminal-controlled servers on bulletproof hosts, there's really no way for us to get the code because it's never ending up on Amazon or Rackspace or legitimate vendors that we can chat with and hopefully get our hands on it. The other thing is they're using commercial copy protection code and obfuscation. So they're using IonCube, which is I hate to suggest that DRM is ever legitimate, but it's like a legitimate commercial software protection for PHP software you can buy. This is some of the code, the way it looks after it's been obfuscated using IonCube. And they're actually using a lot of the different features that this software offers. So if you do buy Black Hole and run it on your own server, they'll restrict the ability to run it to the list of IP addresses that you submit to them, the list of domain names or IPs that you want to run it on. Everything is digitally signed. They can put the time limit for how long the code will run can be embedded into that encryption wrapper that's wrapped around the PHP before it's sent down. And there's been a lot of efforts to work on decoding this stuff. None of them are particularly automated or effective. There's a lot of different versions of IonCube. I believe they're now using IonCube 9, which just came out recently. So there's 3 or 4 different open source tools out there. If you ever run across any of this code that you can use, each one of them will undo different parts of it because they keep changing the semantics and the language they're using to do the encryption or the obfuscation. And using combinations of them, we've been able to partially decode part of Black Hole versions that have been leaked. I believe this is version 1.2.0 that was found in the wild from a guy that had purchased it, that his was managed to be compromised. And you can see some of the different bits and pieces in here where disable checking for license restrictions is set to 0. We can see here server restrictions are set to 1C, which turns it on. Then you can see the different domain names and IP addresses and subnet masks that this person licensed from Black Hole. So when we're looking at the price back here, Some of these things are for additional IPs and domains to allow you to run your own copy of the kit. And then we can see this is the one, this particular guy, the different IP ranges that he was utilizing to with this stuff. But in essence, it's commercial encryption software that's rather hard to decode, and we don't run across copies of it very often, which amplifies things. Because this is sort of like the polymorphism debate when you talk about malware. I mean, malware that was polymorphic started happening around 1990, but it wasn't a big deal because we could reverse the code and see how it was morphing and write identities to identify it. So when the code is exposed to us, it's never a mystery as to how it works. And then we started seeing server-side polymorphism, and that was a problem because we couldn't see the code that was generating the polymorphic. We could only see the results of the code. And as we can acquire the code that generates it, it makes it easier. And it's similar in black hole. I mean, if we can see the way the exploits work, if we can see the evasion techniques, if we can see the encryption wrappers they're using to wrap up the exploits before they send them down, it makes it a lot easier for detection than if we have to look at the encrypted payload. I mean, we know what we can decrypt it and see the payload itself and know what we want to detect, but we'd rather see it when it's, we'd rather be able to predict what it's going to look like and know what those encryption algorithms look like so that as new code gets wrapped in that encryption, we don't have to know about the new exploit. We just see it's using the encryption method and are more easily able to detect it. I'm glad to see that most of the people in the room appear to be over 30, because I was worried people might not know Paunch from chips. But the guy that distributes Black Hole goes by the nickname Paunch. He's quite open about communicating with people, both anti-malware researchers, journalists, other people. Unlike a lot of these guys, he's not brave enough that his real name is out there. Like, we know a lot of the, Pavel Verblevsky and Igor Gusev and some of these other guys that have been involved in the fake antivirus game and the Canadian pharmacies and all this are bold enough that we actually know who they are and where they live and they don't need to hide. This guy's a little more cautious. We do know some private details about, we believe we know where he works, what community he lives in, that type of stuff that has been shared with law enforcement. But why he's chosen the nickname Paunch, we don't know, but he is on ICQ if you want to chat with him. He's on quite frequently. Is happy to provide tech support for people that are purchasing or utilizing the kit from him. And we can see over here the screenshot from one of the less well-secured, it turns out, does anyone want to guess what the password was on this particular Black Hole admin panel? Very close, a little longer. Password 123, yes, somebody said it. These guys are terrible at OPSEC, which is great. I mean, they may be good at breaking through our defenses because they've got, this chain of exploits a mile long that if we don't patch one thing, we're vulnerable suddenly. But on the other hand, they're really terrible at doing the other end of it. But you can also see the popularity. This was in the fall of 2012 that I managed to get the screenshot. And you can see Java, PDF, Java, MDAC, MDAC being the Microsoft Data Access Components as far as the popularity. Now, MDAC is one of those ones that we see that shows up that's a really old exploit that often gets served up to people like us with our, our old unpatched XPs when we're hitting black hole sites. We haven't been able to correlate it really well, but when we see MDAC, and the other big one we see that's old is the Microsoft Help Center vulnerability from 2 summers ago that Tavis Ormandy discovered. And those two, the MDAC and that one, are the 2 oldest typically in the kit that are consistently there all the time. And when we see the numbers, for example, for India or China or anywhere in the Indian subcontinent and that kind of thing, we see the MDAC and Help Center numbers go up. So we assume that they're also there to just capture those people that have either pirated copies of Windows that maybe not be patching at all, that have really old installs. Why waste your Java ODE on potentially a vendor seeing it or somebody discovering you have it if a bunch of your victims are going to be vulnerable to something that old and easy to exploit. This one didn't have a lot of traffic. You can see here the countries, all the numbers are kind of reasonably low there. Usually they have a tendency to stand out based on the sites that a particular person is compromised. So usually you see a strong representation of Germany, Switzerland, France, or US, Canada, etc. But in this case, obviously, not so much. The admin panel, this one's in Russian, but it is available in English and in Russian. The English is not, the Russian's flawless and the English is flawed, so we, again, believe that it's highly likely he's Russian. But just because you're Russian speaking, obviously, it doesn't necessarily make you Russian. So people getting exposed to this, it's not just through drive-by web attacks. When we've been seeing a lot more of the email stuff. Obviously, the workstations in the lab, as I pointed out, are very old, so you see some Outlook Express screenshots here from when we opened up some of the emails to play with them. We see two different versions of the emails. One has the HTML actually with malicious code in the HTML as an attachment to the email, so simply opening that in your browser is enough to direct you to the attacker-controlled servers to give you a payload. The other type is the type where the link goes to a site that's already compromised. So the problem in that case in particular is that there's nothing particularly dodgy for us to, for an anti-spam product or for somebody to necessarily detect here, because nothing malicious is in the email, and most of these links are pointing to sites that were maybe not infected up until a few hours ago, that are legitimate websites that you would have no good reason to typically block. It's not like they're directing you to China or Russia IP ranges that you may decide to electively or selectively block and that kind of thing. They're pointing to the kids' soccer blog in Springfield, Missouri that was compromised because they didn't patch their WordPress, which is often a challenge again when you're talking about trying to do reputational filtering. The email tactics also, you probably have seen your purchased ticket from American Airlines or US Air. We see a lot of, it's very seasonal, so in February it was Valentine's links, the standard stuff, it's packages around Christmas. They're using similar tactics that Zeus and other things were using to distribute via email, but now they're just directing you to the more generic exploit-infected websites so that they can more carefully select what payload to deliver to what people. If you've ever seen the please wait pages loading, especially if you're a script user or somebody that blocks JavaScript, that's almost always a black hole infected site. So that's kind of the signature. All the sites hosting it in the cloud all run Nginx typically. You have to be able to load in the IonCube decoder. So in order to run this IonCube encrypted blob that they distribute black hole in, you actually have to have a server-side module either for Apache or for Nginx in order to actually be able to run that code. So there's sort of a runtime module that knows how to decrypt it. And so during the redirects, you'll see that please wait there. You can kind of see an example here where you see main PHP page equals 0 there. This must have a laser pointer, but I don't know how to operate it. Oh, there we go. So you see the main PHP. So this is the victim website, which just has an iframe in this case. And then the iframe redirects to the attacker-controlled site, which is probably one of the cloud-registered domains as part of the cloud service being offered by Blackhole in this case. So once you hit the attacker domain, this page here, main PHP page equals 0, will serve up some detection code to figure out what you might be vulnerable to. And then once, in this case, it figured out you were vulnerable to a shockwave exploit or a flash exploit. So you can see here it served up some malicious flash. And then HCP is the help center vulnerability. And then it also served up a jar. So if it's not sure what you might be vulnerable to, often there's sort of a generic payload line that will just say serve up these 4, and hope cross your fingers and maybe they'll be vulnerable to one or others. We see a lot of malware picking up cute FTP credentials. We think that's related to black hole. It appears that you get infected with some random thing on your machine. It'll look around and see if there's any stored credentials, because cute FTP credentials aren't stored securely on the workstation. And most people using FTP these days are primarily using it for updating their websites. So that's a great way to get admin credentials to websites in order to put the hidden iframes and stuff on. The other thing, obviously, WordPress vulns. This week, I don't know if anybody's on the WordPress mailing list, but Matt Mullenweg was sending out information about large increases in brute forcing attacks on WordPress sites. So it's not just vulnerable WordPress. It's the fact that most people still have an account named admin, which removes half of the mystery of what you need to log in as. And then the standard poor password practices that often plague things like WordPress. The latest tactic we're seeing now is this malicious Apache module you may have heard of. A lot of the information on this, I've got a link on the next slide, I think, to there's a Japanese blog that's been fantastic about tearing apart the module itself. We haven't done a lot of reversing of the Apache module because it's been rather difficult to come by. But when we start looking at all the ways This was as of March, and we looked at all the websites we were detecting in a given day. Which things did we detect the malware as? And you can see mal iframe AL, which is the code that we detect that's coming from this Apache module that distributes Black Hole, was well over 50–60% of all the sites we detected in that particular day. This has been consistent now for well over 6 or 8 weeks that we've seen this. We see your standard other stuff over here where we see, Trojan JS Reader, which is a JavaScript redirector that we see occasionally. We see, SEO red is related to search engine poisoning and that type of stuff. But none of these really Facebook jacking or click jacking stuff that we see here. Bad source is a source tag that obviously leads you to something bad at the other end. But none of these really account for much percentage. And in any one of these two that are bigger, that actually is detecting a whole swath of different things that just kind of fit a generic pattern for JavaScript stuff or whatever. So those don't even really represent as big a piece of the pie as it looks like in the pie. Whereas this is specific to only that malicious Apache module. So the current trend seems to be, what we don't really get is how this is happening. So we know that the OS almost every time is CentOS and occasionally Debian. It's always Apache 2.2.1 and lower. But nobody's been able to pin down the specific exploit. There must be an exploit involved that's in either Debian or CentOS machines that maybe aren't fully patched. We're not really sure if it's in, because nobody's caught it in action. Nobody's seen a machine getting infected to figure out how are they actually getting in it. Because you have to have root privileges to place an Apache module with the default security settings on either CentOS or Debian. So it's really unclear how they're getting that module onto the victim web servers. Yes, sir. Do you have? I haven't heard anything from that, but I couldn't answer that. Maybe I haven't asked the labs about that. That's a good question. I mean, obviously, we do work with Rackspace and others, and we often let them know what we're trying to get our hands on. I know we've got our hands on the module, but somebody needs to capture it getting on. Because there's 2 friends of mine that are reasonably well respected, they're consultants, have had customers with it on their machine, and they've done full forensic analysis that cannot figure out where the hell it came from. It's almost like you'd need to have a TCP dump or Wireshark running or something on the network to capture the network activity to see what's happening, because there seems to be almost no audit trail on the machine itself. It's very, very weird. And because of the scale of it, you wouldn't think it would be that hard to find it. But to my knowledge, I don't know anyone that's actually figured it out yet. There's a lot of theories, but nobody's really nailed it down. Sorry? How many honeypots are there that are getting hit with it? I have no idea. I know we've done that. I don't know if we've gotten any results yet. I haven't heard anything. But yeah, that's the approach. I mean, obviously our honeypots are fully instrumented to try to detect every little thing that might happen. And we've intentionally set up known versions that match what we've seen victims. And there's almost no one outside of CentOS and Debian getting hit with this. So it kind of narrows it down that there must be something specific about default configs of those web systems when they're set up. So I guess stay tuned. Maybe hopefully we'll blog about more information as we find it. This down here is so it injects every JavaScript on your site, gets this added into it dynamically. So when you look at the files on the disk, they're not modified. The module's dynamically injecting the malicious code. In this case, this is the JavaScript here where it sends you to HTTP, an IP controlled by the attacker, and then what appears to be some sort of hash, and then one of the signatures of Black Hole, q.php, as the file at the end there. This one here is injected into every HTML page dynamically when that module is loaded. So every single HTML page and every single JavaScript gets this added into it as it's hosted up by an infected server. And that was another thing that threw people off at first, is what people like us would call someone up and go, your site is infected. They'd go look at the files on the hard disk and go, no, it's not. And we're like, yes, it is. You're serving up this bad stuff. We keep seeing it over and over again. And it took a little bit to figure out that it was an Apache module that was actually causing the trouble. This was another indicator for us when we started looking at the strings being served up, and obviously it was 94% Apache, 5.5% unknown, because there was some sort of security device between the web server and the internet that was filtering banners well enough that we couldn't accurately identify it as necessarily being Apache. A tiny amount of Nginx, which we assume is actually the black hole kit itself just leaking into some of our data, because it's almost always hosted on Nginx. And then we're not quite sure what these IIS and Lightspeed ones were, but they have to be data errors because they're small enough percentages that it must just be a problem with the way we were collecting data. If we look at it by country, it's almost the exact distribution we would see for regular websites. So when we look at hosting providers, almost half of the websites in the world that are legitimate are hosted in the US, and that's exactly what we see in the data for this. It seems to follow the distribution quite closely to actual just generic web hosting that people choose around the world for legitimate corporate sites and blogs and all this kind of stuff. There's nothing that jumps out disproportionately large that, I don't even see Russia in the list, right? It's not something like that. So I mentioned this at the beginning. Here's another one of the, other than the please wait message I talked about earlier, here's another one that they've changed to. This is more in Black Hole 2. It typically says wait please loading. This is the JavaScript redirect that nobody would ever normally see again unless you're using no script, some sort of JavaScript blocking where you're between the victim website and the kit. So this is the first thing the kit loads up. And what they're doing here is they're loading up plugin detect, a standard library that people use to determine what version of Java you're running or what version of Shockwave or Flash or these types of things to determine which payloads they may want to serve up. Ultimately, no matter which thing you do, you end up getting redirected to something controlled by the attackers that looks like this. Often, this information will determine which customer of the cloud service is what we think that number indicates. It's sort of a hash of the customer ID or something that indicates, because they're all being hosted on a giant cloud. Plugin detect, these are, it is a legitimate library, which is another challenge for us, because every time we see it, we go, oh, it's probably black hole. But it might not be, because legitimate web developers all over the world use plugin detect. There's nothing inherently malicious about it. You can go to their website, determine which things you'd like to detect, and it will generate some dynamic JavaScript code for you to use that will help you detect the versions of these things. Most of the things we see being detected in black hole are PDF, Flash, Shockwave, and Java. They're not ticking all the boxes because they don't necessarily have payloads for all the boxes, so they're mostly targeting the Flash, the reader, the Java, that type of stuff. And again, as far as popularity of exploits, you see that Reader 5, Java 10, this is in one particular recent version. The speed with which they're bringing this stuff in is crazy, right? Like last summer, if you remember, CVE 2012, 1889, I believe it was one of the Java 0 days, and there was a proof of concept. I think JDuck posted a POC that he tweeted about, and within an hour, it was in black hole in the cloud. He didn't make any changes, so it was super easy to detect because, of course, JDuck's POC was public and we could just look at it. But obviously for unpatched workstations or people that didn't have a product that was in place that could detect it, that was a real problem, right? And we saw similar things. I think a lot of the flashback stuff, 2012, 05, 07, last February and March, was also in Black Hat extensively before it was patched by either Apple or Oracle. Java seems to be the primary focus. We haven't seen new reader exploits coming in. The 5 reader ones there have been there almost a year. They haven't iterated, whereas the Java ones are consistently iterating with the newest ones over and over and over again. This I thought was interesting. We published a paper on this about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, which was I think it's called a deeper look inside the black hole exploit kit. And we went by version, seeing which, so one of the signatures of older versions, and they're still using this, it's just more obfuscated now, was this SPL 0 through 7 was in the URL, which told us which exploit was being, or which group of exploits was being served up based on the results of the plugin detect. So we can see the evolution by version, some versions don't have a given exploit, or we weren't able to capture what the exploit was associated with a given version that was any particular URL, because we didn't see any of those. But you can see they bundle them up. So if they determine that you're running an old version of reader, there may be 5 or 6 reader vulns all bundled up into one thing that you'll get served up when you hit that page. And if you look at the most recent ones, it's mostly, you see PDF, Help Center vulnerability, Flash, Java. These are 1.25, I think, was summer of 2012, and 2.0, which we've had a lot more difficulty getting data on. Almost everything we're seeing is Java. I mean, something like 80% or more of at least the URLs we're seeing from victim customer networks are coming in are Java, primarily. And this was an example of just one particular exploit that I thought was interesting, where we looked at the first sample was seen on March 16th, ever, anywhere, and then the May 24th, it was posted on a Chinese forum, which is the first time that, so looking back, after we saw the thing, we were able to go, we actually saw it on March 16th. We didn't detect it or know what it was because it was a 0-day. But evidence goes back to say that it was out there at least at that point. At this point, it was on a Chinese forum. On June 12th, Microsoft published an advisory, and on the 16th, the POC made it into Metasploit, and then on the 22nd, it was added into Black Hole. So what's developed since I made this slide, I guess, that's a little different is that, I don't know why I put this Dooku thing in here. I'll talk about, because this was the Dooku, the font vulnerability in the Windows kernel. And if anybody from Microsoft here? I would love to know why the kernel renders fonts. But this was the kernel font rendering vulnerability that came out of Dooku. What's interesting in a lot of these things is just, you don't typically see a lot of really innovative 0-day necessarily in Black Hole. You see it very quickly after it becomes public, which there may or may not be a patch, so I guess it's technically still 0-day. But what we've learned more recently and over the holiday period around the Christmas time was that he also seems to be selling a much higher end version of the kit called Cool Exploit Kit. And the Cool Exploit Kit will have true, much higher value 0-days. He had a $100,000 fund set up over the Christmas holidays to buy 0-days that he was advertising in underground forums. And he sells the Cool Exploit Kit for $10,000 as opposed to the around $1,000 for Black Hole. So once we detect something that was in Cool and it becomes public that it was in Cool, instantly it goes into Black Hole. So it's almost like he's got like a premium cloud service called Cool, and then he's got the one for the regular criminal plebes that he calls Black Hole. And they migrate from the premium version to the other version once they become public, and there's a POC and Metasploit, or the vendor releases an advisory, or that kind of thing. Basically, once the cat's out of the bag, he moves it into Black Hole. The meat of the project, this was a quote from the forums. Dear ladies and gentlemen, everyone is aware of the problem which exists now in the exploit market. To solve this problem, our team prepared the following exclusive program of purchasing new browser and plugin vulnerabilities. Not only do we buy exploits and vulnerabilities, but also improvements to existing public exploits and any good solutions for improving the rate of exploitation. The meat of this project, we are setting aside a $100,000 budget to purchase browser plugin vulnerabilities which are going to be used exclusively by us without being released to the public. Not only do we purchase weaponized exploits, but also their descriptions and proof of concepts with subsequent joint work with our specialists. So that's kind of interesting, showing the direction he's going with it. Payloads, mostly your standard opportunistic stuff, right? We're not seeing any advanced payloads. We're not seeing targeted attacks using this as a method to get in or anything. Strangely, we have seen some targeted stuff that seem to use from Black Hole that were iterated to avoid detection and then were used to deliver a targeted attack. But Black Hole itself is not involved in it at all. Still tons of Zeus coming out of Black Hole. Ransomware is like skyrocketing. It used to be fake antivirus was a big chunk of what Black Hole was delivering. So it seems like these are the generic payloads, the fake antivirus, the ransomware are sort of the generic payloads, and then the targeted payloads have a tendency to be more like banking Trojans, where they'll divide it up by geo and deliver specific banking Trojans to specific regions based on demand from people allegedly purchasing the traffic. this was some data we had from the end of 2012 on what we saw coming out of black hole. You can see Zbot or ZooSpot, 25%. Ransomware at that point was 18%. I believe they switched places more recently. We're seeing more ransomware coming out of it than than ZooSpot now. And then a variety of mix of other things. Fake antivirus is nearly gone now. We're seeing very little of it. In fact, we saw some accidentally related to a targeted attack that we didn't realize that we were detecting it as fake antivirus. They've started doing VM detection, and then when we're running it in a VM, we get fake antivirus, and we catalog it and flag it as fake AV and throw it in the bin. And then it turned out, actually, it was a targeted data stealer when you didn't run it in a VM. So the only fake AV we're seeing right now seems to be decoy fake AV. We're not really seeing it in the wild anymore. But certainly, black hole is focused on the mass market infection of stuff more than anything else based on the data we have. Not exactly rocket science, but I guess this is kind of what it looks like if you put it all together, right? I mean, a legitimate site gets compromised, typically just an iframe gets injected into it, nothing else harmful on the legit site to detect, simply a misplaced iframe. You get, through JavaScript or iframe, redirected to something controlled by the criminal, the traffic directory server, where they'll do the plugin detect and decide which particular payload and which particular exploit to use based on the customer demand. Then they redirect you to, well, it's a two-stage process, but one where they're doing to detect what the exploits can be, the other to detect where they want, which payload they want to deliver, and then they send you finally to somewhere where you're going to get served up the actual exploit and directed to a payload through the exploit. And I kind of already discussed this. I didn't realize the print was going to turn out to be so tiny, but the green, the red, and the blue here are all black hole. And the rest of these are not black hole. So that's the portion of traffic that we're seeing coming through our web detection right now that's resulting from black hole. I think it's somewhere around 67% is the current numbers there. And that concludes my information on the black hole exploit kit. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Obviously, yes, sir. I don't have numbers. I can tell you anecdotally, which is quite a lot. I mean, and the reaction of people that are compromised is generally negative when you try to contact them. So first reaction is, you're trying to sell me something, go away, even though we're just honestly trying to alert them that something bad has happened. 2, no, I checked my site, it can't be true. Or 3, you just can never even reach anyone, or you go into a black hole. And when we do, we see a lot of repeat. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we don't take infected sites off of our web filter lists if they're not in the Alexa, say, 1 million at all, until we can rescan them in perhaps 90 days, and then they're usually still infected or infected with something else. So if the site, because so much of it is just hobbyist stuff, and that's part of the problem. I mean, it's small businesses. I was joking about a kid's soccer blog, but that is the kind of stuff that's making up the giant numbers of individual URLs that are infected. It's rare that we see one big screw up that results in a whole bunch of it. Like, there was an Italian ISP that had a footer that they put on all the websites that they hosted. So like 30,000 websites got hit in 1 minute, because once they modified that banner and injected a tag into it, all these websites suddenly were infected. But that's really uncommon. Most of it is the garden variety everyday stuff, and those people they probably wouldn't have got hit in the first place if they had the talent to prevent it or the advice from a professional to help them. And so cleaning it up doesn't really, it's a lot harder than it looks. I'm trying to remember there was somebody big in our community was it Dan Kaminsky or someone had gotten hit during Black Hat a year and a half ago or so, that was pretty well known, and it was like actually ended up serving malware 2 or 3 times in a row over the course of a day, thinking he had cleaned it up because the complexity of getting it out of the system was so high. So it's not to criticize the people who get reinfected, because it's often a big challenge. Yes?
So I apologize if this was from recording. Do you have any insight into the kinds of server-side vulnerabilities that are being targeted?
No, no, we talked about that, unfortunately, and not really. I mean, other than CentOS and Debian, Apache 221 and lower, that's currently the signature that we know of that are what all the victims seem to be. But beyond that, you know, we've got the module. So if you're running antivirus on your Linux boxes, arguably you should pick it up. All vendors should be detecting it because it's not, there's nothing fancy in the module that evades detection. But beyond that, we just aren't sure. Like we think it must be existing vulns because it's targeted to these platforms, right? It's not showing up on SUSE. It's not showing up on Arch servers. So theoretically, it's patched in some newer version, or there's some reason that it's more difficult to do on some other version. But considering the vast majority of sites out there running CentOS and Debian as web servers, that might also be why you would target them, because that's probably more Linux servers run that as a lamppost than anyone else. Yes, sir, last question? I believe it's 5. I'd have to check. It's in our blog. If you go to nakedsecurity.sophos.com and put in the name of it's iframe-al if you do a search in the little search box. The last 2 or 3 posts on iframe-al talk about it. I believe it's CentOS 5. Not positive, but there was actually a specific version in lower that's in the blog. So I thank you all for your questions and for attending, and I'll be around the entire conference and look forward to hanging out with everyone. Thank you.